Welcome, everybody. This is Racism and Infectious Disease, a library company seminar. I'm Will Fenton, Director of Scholarly Innovation here at the Library Company. For those of you who don't know us, totally understandable. We were Benjamin Franklin's library, founded in 1731 as the first subscription library. So in some ways, you can think about us as really creating the template, the blueprint for public libraries across the nation. In the 20th century, that we sort of reinvented, reconstituted ourselves as a research library with very sort of special core program areas. And those included, and continue to include early American literature, history, and print culture, women's history, graphic arts, political economy, and honestly, probably the crown jewel of our program, so I'm not allowed to say it, is our African American history program. It's really stunning. So this is our seminar series, and our seminars were launched in 2018 to really offer our community an opportunity to roll up their sleeves and get to know our collections. And unfortunately, we can't do that in person right now for obvious reasons. So we've moved this online. The benefit being that we can bring together folks from all over the country that might not otherwise be able to make it into Philadelphia. And also to offer these things for free, which is always better than having a price tag associated with it. In terms of the structure of this first is going to be sort of an introduction to the overall stakes of the seminar as I know it. It'll be a roundtable conversation. And then in the following two sessions, which will happen in 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks after that, we'll have sessions that really tunnel in on the research of our scholars that are presenting today. I would also add that this is a special kind of seminar because it's being offered in conjunction with our Mellon Scholars program, which you'll hear more about momentarily. So with that, let me briefly, and I have to do this with criminal shortness here, I need to briefly introduce our director of the program in African American history, Deirdre Cooper Owens. Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens is the Charles and Linda Wilson Professor in History of Medicine, as well as the Director in Medicine program at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She also serves as a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. And I would note that her first book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, won the 2018 Darlene Clark Hine Book Award from the OAH as the best book written in African American women's and gender history. Thank you so much for acting as our MC tonight, Deirdre.
Welcome. All right, thank you so much, Dr. Fenton. This is a kind of inside joke. Everybody seems to not be able to say Deirdre smoothly because they're so calling me by my nickname. So you can tell those who are actual friends and colleagues because they will have a hard time saying Deirdre. But thank you all for joining us. I see the numbers growing, and so this is a really wonderful virtual community of a lot of friends and supporters of the Library Company, and in particular the program in African American history. I am extremely pleased to serve in this capacity, but more than that, I am pleased to be able to bring the kinds of programming that excite me. I get to learn from people I admire. I think you are going to be really impacted by what Drs. Richard Mizell and Dr. Samuel Kelton Roberts have to share with us today. They have been kind enough to allow little old me to serve as the moderator of their brilliance. I have known these wonderful men and scholars for some years, and I'm really just pleased when I'm in their presence, and I tend to learn a lot from them, so I'm very happy. So before I begin the formal introductions, reading their bios, I want to say a word about our Summer Mellon Fellows program. This is really a historic moment for us. We have never done this program, this summer program, virtually. We have smaller group because of the impact of the novel coronavirus. And so there are 5 students, but they really represent the best and the brightest of this country's young scholars. We have people who are magna cum laude graduates. We have honors graduates amongst us. We have folk who curate their own online art exhibitions, people who are going off to grad school, current graduate students. And so it really is a source of pride. Jasmine Smith isn't here, but she assists me with the program. She's the reference library in African American history. And we are just every day proud when we have our kind of moments to check in and reflect on the day. We're just like, oh my God, we're so happy we have this cohort in this particular moment. And so they keep us on our toes. And so I wish that you all were here so that you could meet with them and talk with them about their interest. At the end of the seminar, and it's a month-long one, we are going to produce an online exhibition to address the issues of race, racism, and pandemics. Because the library company, although we're the country's oldest cultural institution, we want to remain relevant. We want to have work that resonates with the contemporary moment and all of you who are experiencing this together. And so you'll be able in a few months, probably early to mid-fall, see the online exhibition that our scholars have produced. I'm just the person who's facilitating and helping to curate, but they really are doing the bulk of the research, the writing, and everything. So these are our fellows that will be asking questions towards the end of our conversation. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Richard Mizell, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Houston. He is also the director of graduate studies in the Department of History there. Mizell earned his bachelor's degree in history from North Carolina Central University, a master's degree in history from American University, and a PhD in history from Rutgers University. His research focuses on historical understandings of race and health, medical citizenship, environmentalism, and the transformation of disease identity. Mizell is the author of Backwater Blues, the Mississippi Flood of 1927 in the African American Imagination, and co-editor of Resilience and Opportunity, Lessons from the US Gulf Coast after Katrina and Rita. He's published in a wide range of academic and public venues, including the Journal of African American History, ISIS Journal of the History of Science, Open Rivers Journal, and the American Historical Magazine. Dr. Mizell is currently writing a history of race and diabetes in the 20th century and co-editing the Oxford Handbook of American Medical History. Secondly, Dr. Samuel Kelton Roberts joins us. He is an associate professor of history at the Columbia University Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, also a member of their Socio-Medical Sciences program and African American Studies. And so the Socio-Medical Sciences program is in the School of Public Health at Columbia. He is a former director of Columbia University's Institute for Research in African American Studies. Dr. Roberts is a co-founder of the National Black Harm Reduction Network and serves on the boards of the Alliance of Families for Justice and the Legal Action Center. In 2013-2014, Dr. Roberts served as the policy director of Columbia University's Justice Initiative, where he coordinated the efforts of several partners to bring attention to the issue of aging and the growing incarcerated elderly population. Also in the same year, Dr. Roberts was the policy director of Columbia University's newly inaugurated research publication, Justice Initiative, now the Columbia University Center for Justice, and was the editor of the center's first research publication, Aging in Prison, Reducing Elder Incarceration and Promoting Public Safety, which was published in 2015. At Columbia, he leads the research cluster for historical study of race, inequality, and health. Roberts is also the host of the Public Health and Justice podcast, PDIF. I'm going to try and say it in his voice, People Doing Interesting Stuff, and currently is writing a book tentatively titled To Enter a Society Which Doesn't Want Them, Race, Recovery, and America's Misadventures in Drug Policy. He tweets from @Samuel K. Roberts. So without further ado, I welcome you all. Thank you so much. I'm now going to look professorial and put on my glasses so I can begin our conversation. And so what I'd like for you each to do is just take a few moments and provide some opening remarks. Dr. Mizell, with you starting us off, and then Sam coming in, but just kind of give us some, just a kind of brief, enticing bite to whet our appetites about what is so important about race and epidemics and pandemics and racism, and how this relates to the past, but also this contemporary moment.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Cooper Owens, for inviting me, and also you, Dr. Fenton, everyone else who's been a part of this. This is really a great opportunity and I appreciate it. I've been thinking quite a lot lately about why study disease. This is something that many of us historians of medicine have been thinking about quite a bit in the last several months. Disease becomes an important aspect of thinking about this contemporary current moment. And like many of us, I came to the history of medicine in a circuitous route in many ways. I didn't start off as a historian of medicine, but soon after I got into my master's program, I quickly discovered that medical history helps us to think about the present. And this moment really sort of speaks to a historical truth and a continuity that is very important for us to understand. Diseases and epidemics tell us something very important about time and place. It helps to reveal the social fabric of a particular moment in time. For many of us, one of the first sort of interactions with the history of epidemics and pandemics were the cholera epidemics of the 19th century. And part of what struck me about sort of thinking about the cholera epidemics of the late 19th century, really throughout the 19th century, was that the disease is not so much a biological entity, but it's really a social entity. So as much as cholera tells us about Vibrio cholera and the etiology of that particular disease, in the 19th century, it also tells us about immigration, tells us about race, tells us about Catholicism, Protestantism, the rise of public health. All of these sort of issues then emerge around this concept of disease identity. But diseases also are value laden. And as historians of medicine, we are always conscious of this. Professor Owens talked in her recent op-ed in the Houston Chronicle about the 1793 yellow fever epidemic and how it was perceived that African Americans didn't suffer from yellow fever, that we're somehow immune to the disease. You see, this is a constant refrain in tuberculosis and diabetes and cancer and heart disease. The 1918 flu-influenza epidemic, people argued that the nostrils, the inner lining of African Americans were so thick that it made them immune to the particular disease. And so you see these sort of questions constantly repurposed for the current moment. But it also reveals who's worthy, who's considered to be valuable, who's considered to be unvaluable. And in the current COVID-19 pandemic, you're seeing these sort of terms that are evolving: essential workers, right? These questions of frontline workers. And even that's a very interesting way, because public health and how we think about public health can always take a militaristic framework. Right, it was not unusual for yellow fever epidemics of the late 19th century to be viewed in a militaristic way, of brigades and victories over the disease, the need to have frontline workers of all societies emerging on this particular moment. And so these images and these terms that we're seeing today are nothing new, and that's why in many ways historians are very important. Now, my own work centers around the history of race and diabetes, and similar to, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in sort of my next session, but similar to heart disease and cancer, diabetes was considered to be a disease that was rare among African Americans in the early 20th century. It was primarily considered to be a disease of Jewish identity and civilization. But diabetes is interesting as well, because it's a chronic disease that transformed from an acutely deadly disease into a chronic disease with the insulin revolution of 1921 and 1922. And along with this sort of transformation of diabetes into this chronic disease, you have the complications of diabetes, which include retinopathy, leg amputation, blindness. There was a recent essay published that people have been sending me about amputations and whether there's a disproportionate number of African Americans who have their limbs amputated as a result of diabetes. And of course, diabetes has been sort of in the limelight, quite a bit in the last few months as an underlying condition of the COVID pandemic. But diabetes also speaks to these sort of generational questions of food insecurity, medical deserts, food deserts, poverty, obesity, lack of income usually results in higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of obesity. Eating habits have a significant impact. Ability to access certain foods has a significant impact on rates of diabetes. And so you can't really look at this COVID-19 pandemic in a vacuum. You have to place this longer generational narrative in the conversation. One other sort of example that I sort of think about is, this sort of distinguishing between type 1 and type 2 diabetes, which really does not occur until the 1940s and 1950s. Earlier in the century, diabetes was considered to be thin and obese diabetes. But by the 1950s, with the evolution of autoimmune disease and the distinguishing between type 1 and type 2, type 1 being an autoimmune disease, you have this stigma that would begin to emerge around type 2 diabetes, whereas type 1 was considered to be blameless and sort of worthy of medical care. Type 2 diabetics were considered to be unworthy and blamed for their particular disease through unhealthy eating habits, moral choices, and biological degeneracy. So all of this becomes, very important when we think about sort of these questions around COVID and this current pandemic, because even to this very day, the perception is that only whites suffer from type 1 diabetes, but not type 2. So you have this epidemic, really, of African Americans who are suffering from type 1 diabetes, but are misdiagnosed for racial and historical and social reasons. So when we're having these conversations around the current pandemic and who's suffering, whose visibility is front and center, there's a history to this that we must always take into consideration. And so, people often ask me, why diabetes? And, diabetes, I came to diabetes almost intuitively from my work on Hurricane Katrina and the 1927 flood. When I began to have these conversations around special needs populations, dialysis populations in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, diabetes was a moment for me to think about this much longer history. And so one way that we can think of COVID, and another way we think about diabetes as a chronic disease, is diabetes really does narrate the entirety of the 20th century. If you want to know what the history of the 20th century can be or is, look through diabetes. Diabetes helps us to narrate questions of immigration at the turn of the 20th century, World War I, New Deal, Progressive Era before that, World War II, Civil Rights, Black Power era, sort of post-Civil Rights era, policy, theology, philosophy. Diabetes has an impact on all of these things. And so disease as an identity, as a biological and a social entity, helps us to illuminate all of these overlapping questions that we are grappling with today. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much. Dr. Roberts?
All right, thank you. I have some visual aids here. So what I will do is, please nobody laugh at my technological challenges here. All right. Here we go. Okay, I take it we can see that, Dr. Cooper Owens, or yeah, all right, fantastic. Actually, maybe that's not I'm sorry, that's not actually the right one. All right. All right. Thank you so much. I've been looking forward to this conversation. In a lot of ways, it's like conversations that Deirdre Cooper Owens, because those of us who call her Dee Dee, yes, we do have trouble with the first name, as Dr. Cooper Owens and as Dr. Mizell, the three of us have had conversations like these over many years. And I've really been looking forward to doing this in a public forum and also to do so with the Mellon Fellows at the Library Company. I thought I would speak just very briefly about the function of stigma in epidemics such as the one in which we find ourselves, but also in others throughout history, stigma and race in particular. When I teach my lecture course in inequality and health in the 20th and 21st centuries, I encourage my students to think in terms of structures and to think in terms of what stigma itself, what functions it performs. That's to say that right off the bat, I introduced them to a version or a vision of stigma that doesn't see it simply as, you know, one person who doesn't like another, or one group of people that doesn't like another group, but that it actually serves a political, ideological, rhetorical, and social function. Quick selfless plug. We just launched another podcast on Black Lives in the era of COVID-19. You can find it on any platform, at any podcast platform near you. We've got about 3 interviews up. It's been a fascinating experience. And so you can see what people who do this work in the field are saying and doing in the pandemic. My earlier work was in tuberculosis, which, as you see from this graph, had a disproportionate effect on African Americans. Like COVID-19, it was an airborne disease, though not viral, bacteriological, but very much a disease of structure, particularly housing, of income inequality and wealth inequality, of food scarcity, what today we would call food insecurity. And any time between, say, 1880 and 1940, it would have been the number 1, 2, or 3 killer of urban Black Americans. So it was very much on the mind of our leaders. It was, in fact, one of the earliest examples of what we call the health effects of residential segregation, which you can see here. I'll just distill this into a few points. The health effects of segregation refer to differentials in health outcomes experienced by populations by virtue of social, economic, and geographic experiences. So all the things I mentioned with tuberculosis are part of that. But in different diseases, there might be something else. But the segregation that we saw as de facto or de jure law until the 1960s, and which continues today de facto, have certainly an outsized impact on Black health. Stigma comes in because, as I encourage my students to understand, stigma comes in as a way of rationalizing what we might think of as the contradictions in racial capitalism. If in any given society, let's just take, for example, ours, you have an ideology of merit, of democracy, of a ladder that, you know, you could climb upwards, of, you know, a certain degree of upward mobility, et cetera. And then when that's manifestly not the case, stigma has a very, you know, from the vantage point of the stigmatizers, it's a very useful way of rationalizing that which should not be reconcilable given what is putatively our political organization, which is to say social democracy. In short, it's really a good way of blaming the victim. And as such, this often comes to play in public health campaigns where we spend quite a bit of time thinking about how we control individuals and their behavior, not thinking structurally. We see this as recently as the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic, but we've seen it in pretty much every public health campaign that we've had in the modern era. This is a pamphlet from 1916 that's basically just says, "Our tuberculous Negro, where is he now?" It's a short pamphlet, but trust me, the answer is not in there. It's spoiler alert, okay? Here we see another example of also how stigma will serve the purpose of discrediting popular political demands. And so the political cartoon on the right is from a journal called the Journal of Outdoor Life. It's not a Klan journal. This is actually a tuberculosis journal, which later become, you all might recognize that, I believe it's still in print, as basically just an outdoors life journal. Here it runs a political cartoon encouraging its readers to be scared of Pullman porters. And they make using a racial epithet, make a pun on Pullman and pulmonary tuberculosis here. In fact, Pullman porters, as many of you know, were actually some of the intellectual and political leaders of the Black community in the early 20th century, who would have been the first to demand fair wages for their work, and also to lead and to join with other labor organizations to do the same. So this is a way of discrediting them as being really just vectors of transmission and nothing else. Here we see another, similar to the pamphlet I showed you 2 slides ago about finding the cases. Here, the stigma is on Black women workers. And this is something that's been also discussed by historians such as Darlene Clark Hine, after whom Dr. Cooper Owens' award 2 years ago was named. Tara Hunter, Susan Smith, and others have also talked about the intersection of Black labor and public health campaigns. And here we see the steps that go into finding the tuberculous Negro of sorts. And here she's a nurse. And we see where we find they trace the woman name. This is kind of like case finding as you hear about it today, originates in the late 19th, early 20th century. And here this case finding exercise traces Eliza to home conditions that are that were clearly spreading tuberculosis, or so the pamphlet wants you to believe. All right. Now I want to say that at the same time, I do not want to ignore what Black social movements for health were, because there in that history, you will find the most prescient analyses of structural inequality and health. On the left is, well, on the right is a image from a Black tuberculosis exhibition in Texas, where Dr. Mizell resides, though this is in Dallas, where they're encouraging people to remember that a fine-looking body may conceal tuberculosis. This is an injunction to have yourself checked, to be tested as such. And here we have, you know, clearly as the title displays, a young man who's in good physical health. He's clearly, you know, face forward. This is a kind of image of a new Negro, so to speak, in the a little bit after the New Negro movement of the 1930s. To the left are a series of plates in Du Bois's 1906 Health and Physique of the Negro American, where he's actually aesthetically and photographically answering back to a 19th and 20th century genealogy of eugenic photography that used the front and the side profile to show the inferiority of various races. And here Du Bois has African Americans dressed in various finery, and clearly, as in the image on the right, of face forward, looking at the camera, and clearly very proud. So this is a kind of counter discourse to the idea and the stigma of racial inferiority. And then, of course, nationwide, there were examples of African American health organization politics. The Atlanta conference meetings, of course, in which, well, of course, which I've misspelled on my card here, I apologize for that, which were led after the first 2 years by Du Bois. National Negro Health Week, begun by Booker T. Washington in the year of his death and carried on into the 1950s. The Women's Club movement, Black independent hospitals, neighborhood cleanup drives, and et cetera. All of these are part of the political landscape that we don't really think of when we talk about the history of public health, at least not as it's taught often in public health schools or in our arts and sciences schools. Stigma shows up in the war on drugs. And this is where my current work has been, working in drug policy and the idea of rehabilitation and how that's differentially been applied to African-American populations. I could talk a bit more about that in the discussion. But I encourage my students to think not about the disease, but think about the social function that it performs, or at least how our reaction is an expression of our social organization. And so one of the things that I really adjure them or encourage them to understand is that it was never really about the drugs, ever. Stigma against drug use in the 60s and 70s had declined. However, we saw forces in the 1980s which used it, that stigmatized drugs, largely ones that they said were found exclusively in Black communities. And that's how we got crack cocaine laws. But even before that, we had the Rockefeller drug laws against heroin as well. So I encourage my students to think about stigma against people who use drugs and against drugs themselves as really performing a political function. And then, just to end, I will say with COVID-19, has it meet structural inequality? And this is something I've been thinking a bit about, I think, as we all have. we have, of course, seen even amidst the protests, or particularly amidst the protests against police brutality, we've also seen how COVID-19 morbidity and mortality has fallen unequally on Black populations, be it because of predisposing or pre-existing conditions, but also because of social position, either by housing or by occupational structure or other, by mass incarceration or other factors as well. Just to show you an example of how stigma, just one example of many in this past 3 months. You all might have heard of, there was a house party in Chicago, and the man who threw the party was roundly chastised nationally by the mayor and then by everybody else. And it turned out he apologized profusely to the world. And it turned out it was a party for 2 of his friends who had been killed in gun violence. And he had invited a smaller group of people, but the word got out and everyone wanted to really, in a sense, to have a party to celebrate their two fallen friends. And it really, it said something to me in one case, because when the pandemic first broke out, I was speaking with some students at another medical school, and we were just looking up statistics from police violence, not knowing that George Floyd was coming down the pike, unfortunately, but we knew about police violence and police murder. I'm sorry, I missed my slide there. And it turned out that a University of Michigan study had shown that police violence was like the 4th leading cause of death for young Black men, which still puts it ahead of COVID-19. And so this, we should really think about that. This, Janelle Wright's friends didn't die of police violence, they died of gun violence, but that is also a public health crisis in our communities. And so it shows us that we should not assume that what we think as public health professionals about a disease really is what other people may be thinking about it and how they judge their risk. So stigma is also a way of deploying a risk analysis as well. So I'll leave it there. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you to the Library Company of Philadelphia and to the Mellon Scholars as well.
Thank you. Okay, so we have opened up the Q&A function, and as I'm looking at my screen, it should be towards the, not the very far right, but the Q&A little word bubbles to the right on the bottom of the screen. And you can type in your questions. We are gonna have a Q&A where we will, I'm saying we, I'm taking myself off the hook. Doctors Mizell and Roberts will be able to answer your questions and respond to your comments as well. And it's going to be a holistic one as well, because we're also gonna have our fellows be involved in this conversation during the Q&A segment as well. So thank you so much. I mean, you've given us a lot of food from thought. You've kind of traced the, I always call it the point of origin story for lots of things that are epidemics that people don't tend to think of as epidemics. Often when I pose the questions to my students in class, well, what's an epidemic? They can say smallpox or maybe yellow fever. But often I'll say, well, what about HIV/AIDS? What about these epidemics that we've lived through? What about things that are called epidemics that we may have questions about, like obesity, all of those kinds of things, right? And so, Sam, I like the framing of stigma. And so if I can kind of follow that through with my first question to both of you, thinking about stigma kind of in the background, as you've explained for us, I'd like for you to really describe, for those of us who are viewing this, describe for us how your knowledge about past epidemics or pandemics is important for us today, living through COVID-19. When this first started, at least in coverage in the US, it tended to be linked to the 1917, 1918 influenza pandemic. And much of that has kind of faded away. So explain why a past knowledge is really important for helping us to understand this present moment.
Well, one way I would say is, one of the historical truths of epidemics and pandemics like COVID is this desire to suppress information and knowledge around a particular pandemic. And you saw that with influenza, and you saw that in some ways with yellow fever, and You see this with COVID as well. And part of that is to first try to deny its existence, but then to also place blame once the deaths are can no longer be ignored. And so there's always this tension. There's always this desire to place blame on something, someone, or a group of individuals. Whether it's patient zero, quote unquote patient zero with the HIV, AIDS epidemic, or wet markets from China, or sort of individuals immigrating into this country. It makes other groups of people or certain individuals feel better about a disease when they can assign blame. And by assigning blame, that becomes part of this social narrative of creating and maintaining stigma, that you're unworthy, we're worthy, you're the reason why this disease exists, and we need to then express control over you and this certain group of people. And so the desire to do that then is old. But there are also other sort of epidemics that sort of express a certain kind of stigma that we don't often think about, like Pellagra, for example. Pellagra was an epidemic that killed over 100,000 people during the first 4 decades of the 20th century. Pellagra, of course, was a B3 niacin deficiency, which wasn't eradicated because it still pops up in certain pockets of the country and in other parts of the globe. But there was also this stigma of who was at the time perceived as spreading Pellagra and who was susceptible to Pellagra, but also sort of stigma on who can be experimented on to help to gain an understanding of Pellagra. So these questions then have a long history that COVID again is revealing.
You would think that I would have learned by now not to speak after Rick Mizell, because he brilliant insights. I feel like I could just add a few things to that, and that might be just it. I agree 100% with that, and would also add that stigma also performs a certain narrative work as well. But keep in mind that taking the point of view of a social construction of health and medicine view, that viruses, bacteria, are really just, they're value neutral things. They just do what they do, really. They're neither good nor evil. What makes them so damaging is in a lot of ways our response to them and how well we're prepared for them. And quite often what we do to prepare and how we respond reflects our own narratives, pre-existing narratives about how society is ordered and how it should be ordered. So when a pandemic shows up like COVID-19, and we spend a lot of time thinking about, who are the super spreaders, for example. I don't know if you all remember that narrative from a couple of months ago. As Dr. Mizell said, we were so preoccupied with Wuhan and wet markets, and then we quietly found out that actually the strain that came to the United States probably came here from Europe, and then you did not hear so much stigma about that. That's all a narrative right there. I would also say that what I found interesting with COVID-19 is that with all of our discussions about preparation, and rightfully so, we had a certain amount of agonizing over where's the PPE. We were supposed to have a stockpile of PPE, and we found out that Trump quietly, I guess, sold it all away or something. I don't know, but there were plans that had been made in the previous administration to prepare for a pandemic, and those were discarded. Yes, that conversation is one that we should have had. We certainly should have a discussion about, how can we deploy tests, and then how can we prepare our researchers to make a vaccine as soon as the virus shows up. But what we really haven't had is a discussion about like our social and economic preparation. In a country which purports to be one of the wealthiest and strongest on the globe, we have one of the most anemic social welfare systems. And if you look at some of our fellow, OECD countries, they weren't stricken nearly as hard as we were. I think largely because there was a more robust safety net. you know, in France, it's routine for people to have a month or more vacation every year just for being French, really. Nobody here, or very few people here, can afford that. And so people who we would normally like to shelter in place were not able to do that, and they still aren't. So I would say that we should really think about how we interrogate our narratives of or just of diseases generally, because quite often that means we're focusing on one thing when we could be focusing, or even should be focusing, on something else.
Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do is actually change course, because I'm getting a lot of questions, and also our fellows are like wanting to ask questions as well. And so to the attendees who I can't see, but I see your numbers, what I'm going to do is just allow a few of our fellows to just pose some questions. And then there are a number of questions from the Q&A that I'd like to ask too. Taylor Robinson has a number, Megan Piorco, Mizelle Sanford. And so once our interns ask questions, then I'm going to go to the questions that have been submitted via Q&A. So thank you for your patience. Gigi, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, my question may be a little bit idealistic, but at the main core, I just want to know, what do you guys think would be the best way to, like, not necessarily break away from the stigma, but what do you think, you guys, is it up to us as a community to break the stigma, or is it from the way we are perceived?
Rick, should I go first on that one?
Yeah, you go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, my short answer is yes, absolutely. I think it is our duty to interrogate stigma, to deconstruct it, to really point out the damage that it does and the political and ideological functions that it performs. That's not just the simple work of, it starts with the simple work of pointing that out. But I would also argue that it also stems from political power. The people who are most powerless are usually the people upon whom the stigma is foisted. And that's just that's just old school, analysis of capital, really, right? That's what ideology is all about. So I would say it's two-pronged. It is the work that we do as individuals in our social circles, in our workplaces, and in the world. But also, I think it's about political power.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. You see some of this work occurring in medical schools with the work of medical humanities programs coming into existence. There have been a few, but there's a slight. A little excited about where this turn can go in medical humanities in terms of sort of more recent medical schools here at the University of Houston that are serious about thinking about medical humanities and how we think about the training of physicians, the training of nurses who hold these biases in their interactions with patients. One thing that has not come out as much yet are sort of, problematic interactions between patients and physicians while in the hospital. And that's a question that we also need to address. But also as sort of a broader concept of this, we need to have sort of really more sort of complicated, conversations about white supremacy, white entitlement, but also really helping people or pushing people to disentangle their unconscious bias and sort of what they think they know about the world, right? And sort of what people think they know about the world is difficult to break down. I tell my students, if you go out on the street and you ask a random person, does race exist? Some of them will say, yes, absolutely, without question, race exists. And then you ask them to explain to them why race exists, then all of a sudden they become fantastically inarticulate, right? The flip side to that too is if you ask someone whether race exists and they say without a doubt race does not exist, sometimes they can't tell you any more about why race doesn't exist than those individuals who think that race does exist. So these misconceptions, these perceptions, these ideologies, wrong-headed, are persistent, and they are mundane, and we have to begin to disentangle them from a level of minutia all the way to the highest levels.
Thank you. So our interns have some questions, and like I said, then we'll be able to go to the Q&A from our attendees. So first, we're going to have in order Michaela, Christophorus, and then Abby.
Hello, I just want to say thank you for speaking to our cohort as we kind of curate our exhibit. And most importantly, some of your comments will be definitely impacting the way in which I think about my exhibit. My question is about how your work collectively discusses the intersection of race, medicine, and health. But I'm also interested in like how the environment and also the built environment impacts infectious diseases and its spread amongst Black populations.
Rick, I may go first now just because I think yours might be longer than mine because of where your work is. So I'll just be quick if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. From my earlier work, I did get, that was one of my early exposures to environmental justice and inquiries about built environment, particularly because infectious diseases are functions, at least as they elaborate themselves over populations, i.e. through epidemics and then also pandemics. Is quite often, they move over the terrain of the built environment. So absolutely, that's part of that. In my current work with, in terms of the idea of addiction and rehabilitation, it's a bit different because I'm thinking about the kind of a built social environment or a socially built environment where people are engaging with each other in terms of their recreation and their pleasure and how the use of substances falls into that and then how that becomes prey to stigma as well. So it's quite often a discourse about built environment that plays into that, such as, slum conditions, rundown communities, dysfunctional families. All of that plays into drug policy, beginning as far back as the 1940s and 1950s.
So there's definitely a similarity between pandemics, epidemics, and natural disasters. For example, part of the argument of my first book was that there was a double environmental burden of race for African Americans who were surviving the 1927 flood. They not only had to survive the high water and the rain and the flooding, but also Jim Crow segregation and violence. Sort of thinking about one individual who was forced to work on a levee for upwards of 18 hours straight, went home, and within an hour, a white person was knocking on his door telling him to go back to the levee. And when he refuses, they shoot him. And so the built environment of the levees, the 27 flood, but also race and racism converge in that particular way. Piece I recently published, which is a short piece, was on diabetes and Hurricane Katrina. And part of what I argued in that piece was that in some ways Katrina pulled back the curtain on an epidemic of diabetes in a number of ways. Those individuals, there were some individuals who did not know they had diabetes until they moved into the shelters or moved to different parts of the country. But there was also a failure of the government and also the rehabilitation aspect of the landscape and those individuals in the shelters when there was not insulin provided in sufficient quantity or quality in these shelters, but also foodstuffs, right? So people, that's one of the bright spots of Hurricane Katrina, that people sent food into New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. But many of those foods were not diabetic friendly. They were high in salt and high in sodium. And going back to Samuel's point, that's a matter of planning. How do we plan for an epidemic, both socially, politically, and culturally? Diabetes is a disease where you have to self-manage your disease. And so the diabetics are capable of self-managing their disease. But when there's a disaster, when there's a disruption, that's where the landscape and the environment coalesce in a way that makes people particularly vulnerable. I end that particular piece by talking about those individuals who are evacuating evacuating through flood waters with a sort of mixture of ooze and sewage and other sort of toxins that you don't want to know about is one thing, but it's a completely different thing when you're diabetic and you have skin abrasions, you have ruptures on your skin. All of these things can lead to further complications. And so that's an important aspect to think about as well. And I've also, I'm glad to hear about this online exhibition because I have one that I'm supposed to come out. I don't know exactly when, but it's on lead poisoning and the history of lead poisoning in the 20th century, which is another moment in which sort of the deadliness of lead poisoning was known throughout the 20th century, but there was a suppression of that really until the middle of the century in the civil rights era, all the way up to the Kennedy-Krieger experimentation in the 1990s. So it's a great question, and it's definitely an important intersection between environment, race, and health.
Hello. I just wanted to very quickly revisit the topic of stigma from a few moments ago. So the one cartoon whose aim of which was to spread stigma that was on the PowerPoint earlier made me think of something, and I was interested in hearing a little more about how racialized stigma around health, and more specifically epidemics, how the spread of stigma has changed from the early 20th century to the modern day as different forms of media have emerged, such as we saw the cartoon a few moments ago in print, but I guess my question is stigma when it comes to health and medicine and race spread in the same way it was 100 years ago or 120 years ago, or how has that changed?
That's an excellent question. Thank you, Christophorus. I'm about to give you the frustrating historian's example, which is to say that a lot has changed and nothing has changed. But sorry, that's what it is. I would say what has not changed particularly might be that stigma is still, it's part of how we narrate our lives, and that's kind of unavoidable, the narration part, right? I mean, we make sense of the world through how we make sense of the world, and that's through the stories we tell ourselves. That I think is that's held fast for that's kind of part of that's what historians are about in a lot of ways, right? Interpretation and narrative creation. What probably has changed, of course, is the type of media that through which the narrative moves. Clearly we have more of that today. I'm not certain that it's that the quality of it though is much different. Sometimes there's just more of it. The same way that we have, because of various social media platforms, we have access to counter narratives. We also had those as well some odd years ago. Today it's just more of it. So yeah, there's an aspect of it that's different, but also has stayed the same.
Yeah, I would just add to that briefly. I was sort of thinking about sort of how sort of racialized and stigmatized sort of narratives are reproduced across time and space. And I was thinking about Natalie Molina's book on sort of immigration and her sort of very rich discussion of racial scripts. And particularly thinking about racial scripts as a theory of the perpetual foreigner, where it doesn't matter where someone is born, people of Latin American descent or Latin descent, they are or can be constantly conceptualized as a foreigner, even though we were born and raised in Utah, right? So that is in some ways very visible, but also very, very subtle in terms of the way that they're treated, sort of perceptions of them, and the way in which sort of policies are made to essentially counter their presence.
Thank you.
I would like also to add to that as well. and thank you for that, Rick. 'Cause it actually did make me think of something else that I had intended to say earlier on. That is also part of the function of stigma in terms of identifying, a quote unquote other, as Rick said, a perpetual foreigner. Also part of that is delineations between, what like anthropologists said, many decades ago, between purity and danger, for example. That these are functions that we see not just in public health and medicine, but in other realms of social and political activity, and including, our public policy and our laws as well. So that often has remained the same, even though the contours may have changed. So for example, stigma against Black women has been, that's kind of part and parcel from before the period that Professor Cooper Owens studies until, today, for example. That contours of how that has elaborated itself over the decades and centuries has changed. So I would argue that, for example, laws against fetal drug exposure, which we saw proliferate in the 1980s and beyond, which is to say we hypercriminalized anybody who might have used any substance while they were pregnant. Served a dual function of being at once anti-choice, anti-abortion rights, but also it was applied almost exclusively against Black and brown women. And that's clearly something of more of the late 20th century with biomedicine than you would have seen in the early 20th century, but not very different from the type of stigma that we saw with tuberculosis against Black women. So again, there's the changing same nature of that.
Thank you both. So what I'm going to do now, since we're kind of nearing that the last 30 minutes, Abby, I'd like for you to pose your question, and then immediately after Tiffany, so that Doctors Mizell, and Roberts can be able to answer them, kind of right after each other. Thank you.
Dr. Mizell and Dr. Roberts as well, since this question touches a bit on stigma. In thinking about like race and illnesses like diabetes that are commonly associated with weight, I think one of the first things that come to mind for me is the stereotype of the mammy as like this early visual association of Black bodies and being overweight, and how images like that are kind of broadcast to the world as like this symbol for Blackness. Like, in your research on diabetes, have you found links between like a fear of Blackness and a fear of being overweight? Does the fear of being overweight in that case stem more from like a fear of being unhealthy or a fear of exhibiting a trait that some people have come to associate with Blackness?
Well, I think that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, let Abby, I'm sorry, Tiffany pose her question. I know you want to go into that.
No.
I'll let Tiffany, and then you can get it.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, awesome. So my question had to do with the Black health movements that Dr. Roberts mentioned. More so, my question is mainly directed at the success of those, and just how successful were they at actually breaking down stigmas during that time?
Okay, so briefly to Ms. Posey's question, the early 20th century, thinness was not necessarily a good thing in the perception of individuals, right? It's the more weight you had on you, that sort of in many people's minds coincided with healthiness. And so that narrative of being overweight as a way of being unhealthy and stigmatized, again, really began to emerge in the mid-century. Particularly as that type 2 designation began to emerge. And, as people began to sort of think about the epidemiology of diabetes and the etiology of diabetes and sort of what caused people to become sort of diabetic, you slowly do get this connection between weight and type 2 diabetes. That said, there were also sort of people who were thin who were suffering from both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. But the individuals who were white and thin largely escaped the stigma around that. so that weight became a Black diabetic thing in a way that it did not with whites. And so that stigma, which began around the 1950s and definitely by the 1960s, I'm talking specifically about diabetes, is still with us today. To go into Ms. Toombs' question, I do think, I was thinking about the AK Mississippi Health Project, which was in occurrence from 1935 to around 1941. And I do think that they made a significant impact. Some argue that they're really the first sort of traveling medical clinic. They held clinics around, big trees and in churches and homes and anywhere that they could to help educate individuals about, obesity, diphtheria, typhoid, other dietary concerns. And so in some ways it was a localized, but it helped to transform the culture and identity. But you also, one aspect of my research is around the civil rights era as well. And sporadically you see the NAACP and the SCLC, but also as Alondra Nelson has talked about, Black Panther Party, really putting up front these conceptualizations of disease and sort of these wrong-headed ideas of disease and how we might go about reversing some of these trends within certain neighborhoods. And so I do think that they were effective in changing the health outcomes, but also in changing the mindset as well. I would add to something that Professor Roberts said earlier. One of the industries that was really at the forefront of exposing some of these hypocrisies of sort of disease identity was the Black insurance companies. United in New York, North Carolina Mutual, North Carolina, and Durham, Atlanta Mutual. In some ways, they were among the first to really sort of pinpoint that there were problems in of certain disease within certain African-American communities, but also importantly, that the white insurance companies were sort of evoking a racialized framework for thinking about some of these issues.
Thank you. To add to that, and that's a great question, Tiffany. To add to that, I would say the difference between some of the health movements of a century ago or more versus the ones we've seen over the last 30 to 50 years is that in the former case, they were quite often more quote unquote professionally led. So these would have been, so for example, National Negro Health Week typically would have been run by basically the Black elite for the most part. These would have been physicians for the most part, certainly Black nurses, church pastors, educators, etc. We don't typically think of them as being quote unquote grassroots movements. Certainly many people who are working class joined those movements and, with great enthusiasm, but we don't see them really being led as much as such, or really their points of view being taken really quite seriously in terms of how they did the programming for that. What that movement or what those movements did do is open the way professionally for those physicians and for those healthcare professionals to desegregate hospitals and clinics into the 1950s and 60s and beyond. However, I would say in the post civil rights era and beyond, we are more likely to see movements that are actually quote unquote more grassroots. And so Dr. Mizell just mentioned Alondra Nelson's book, Body and Soul, where there were in fact physicians who worked within the Black Panther Party. However, it was their health movements were very much ones that were, very much lay organized as well. And more importantly, I would say, is the ethos around which they were organized. They took their cues from Chairman Mao's barefoot doctors, people or political leaders such as Che Guevara, who himself was a physician and believed in a community health ideal, an ideal that you still see in Cuba today. And Cuba has, to this moment, as far as I know, the most robust or the best health outcomes in the Western Hemisphere. People live longer there than they do in the United States. And so that was part of an early part of a trend that we see later on, where you have grassroots movements in, reproductive justice, for example. Part of the RJ movement, and even more largely the abortion rights movement, was that abortion does not necessarily need to be a technocratic affair. That the idea that it should be housed all in the hands of male doctors, or just doctors really, came into question in the 1960s and 70s, and still today. In the area that I work in, harm reduction, that is, it's increasingly co-opted by medicine and public health. But for its first 30 odd years or so, was definitively a grassroots, underground, and guerrilla movement. In fact, handing out clean needles was a crime until, well, depends on what state you're in. It's still a crime today, really, in some places. So I think today is much different. That's one of those things that we have definitely seen a sea change. I agree with Dr. Mizell and rooting that in some of the ideals of popular democracy that we saw with civil rights, with the women's health movements, with anti-colonial movements that we've seen from the 50s and moving forward.
Thank you all so much for some really engaging questions. You're making me look good, so I'm especially happy about your participation. I do have a couple of questions that have been posed in the Q&A. Some of them I think have been answered, but I'm going to start here with, I think this is a really good question by Taylor Robinson, who's posed a few really good questions. Taylor asks, what can the public health field do to educate students on the other side of public health? And he has Taylor has in parentheses, I'm sorry about the gender pronoun. Taylor has in parentheses the conference and meetings planned by Du Bois, for example, that Dr. Roberts mentioned. Is a medical history class necessary?
Thank you for that. I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but I'm going to take a stab at it nonetheless. On the other side of public health, I take that to mean lay students, people who aren't necessarily students in public health schools. But I can also address what we should do, what we should be and are doing in terms of public health education as well. I think the way that of the three of us, meaning Doctors Mizell, Cooper Owens, and myself, the way we approach history of medicine is very much one that integrates that history within social history and intellectual history and political history. So I think for my money, well, obviously I'm going to say that's the future of it, because I see myself as part of that movement. But with good reason, I prefer to think of it that way. For a very long time, history of medicine was taught as what I, offhandedly call, great white men in great white coats, really. And that's been a narrative that obfuscates and devalues, the work that people have done to secure their own health, organized or individual, but particularly organized. And then also, it doesn't really give much credence to the perspectives of people who are lay workers or just lay people who aren't health personnel. And so a new form of teaching history of medicine and public health should impart that to this current generation of students. I would say more or less the same, in fact, for our public health students who want to join the ranks of professional healthcare and professional public health administration and research. That those lessons are equally important there, if nothing else, because the history of public health is littered with the mistakes that have been made in the name of public health, and which will continue to be made without a sense of that history. And I would say the first thing is that people in public health often get very smug about how right they are. And that type of smugness often leads them to advocate very punitive things, such as we should criminalize not wearing a mask, or, criminalization of, I don't think there's anybody here on this call who would say cigarette smoking is a good thing, right? But, look at how the criminalization falls on people who are caught smoking cigarettes at certain places. Really, it's not about the law, it's about your color of your skin. And we look at somebody like Eric Gardner, who was selling cigarettes off license, and he died for that. And so we have to really be careful about, we in public health, advocating extreme measures because we think this is the right thing and it's good for the public's health. Because quite often, no less so with law enforcement, when all you have is a hammer, everything starts to seem like a nail, and you just want to beat things into shape. I kind of mangled that metaphor there, but I think you all understand what I'm trying to say. So thank you for the question. It's a very important one. It continues to have relevance in our educational system.
And Taylor just contextualized, Taylor stated, by the other side of public health, I meant that grad students learn about disease discovery, but not so much about the American history that was mentioned in the presentation. So just a point of context there.
It sounds like I construed the question appropriately then. Did I get it right?
Yeah,
you
did, for sure.
Thank you.
Sorry, Rick, if I cut you off, sorry. You have to unmute.
Dag, I was hoping I didn't do that this whole time. I'm with Sam on sort of how he thinks about particularly the teaching aspect of this. I sometimes teach medical history courses, race and racism, and American science and medicine, but I also sometimes teach civil rights movement and the survey. And I'm kind of known throughout UH as the disease and disaster guy, because it seems like that's what I talk about. But even in the survey, when I'm talking about eugenics, or I'm sorry, when I'm talking about the progressive era, I'm often framing it within sort of a conversation of eugenics. When I'm talking about the civil rights era, I frame it within the context of the Medical Committee for Human Rights and Black Panther Party and sort of these other conversations around disease. And so for me, it's there's really no separation anymore. Maybe there used to be, but there's no separation. How I think about American history is through the lens of sort of this framework of disease and identity. The only other thing I would add about sort of this question of public health is that, I'm sort of been, I read a lot of stuff, but I've also, been reading a lot of public health, sort of stuff in the last at least 4 or 5 years, and thinking about what history has to say about sort of public health, and sort of going back to this recurrent theme of stigma, but also the environment as well. One piece that I have coming out at some point, which is taking me an awful long time to get out. So all of you young scholars don't get frustrated. It can take a while sometimes, but it's on the death of Diamante Driver, who was a 12-year-old African-American boy in Prince George's County, Maryland, who died from a tooth abscess that spread to his brain and caused a tumor. His family was on Medicaid, but it took him upwards of months his brother and himself to find a provider. His brother suffering from tooth decay as well, but by the time Diamante Driver got attention, he suffered from subdural empyema, which is a rare bacterial infection of the outer portions of the brain. So what does this tell us about sort of public health and the built environment? And in sort of doing research for this essay, you start to think about all of these other sort of questions about sort of public health that we don't necessarily address as much as we should, like transportation. Here in Houston, if I wanted to go to the other side of the city on the bus, it might take me 4 hours. Houston is a big city. The public transportation is not that great. Same thing in Prince George's County, Maryland. You almost have to have an automobile in Prince George's County, Maryland, even though it's a suburb. And there's some affluent parts of PG County. There are also some very suppressed or sort of depressed aspects of Prince George's County as well. But you also begin to think about these conversations around, physicians who, for one reason or another, decide not to take Medicaid or have Medicaid days in which Medicaid patients are disciplined to one particular day of the week, maybe a Tuesday or Wednesday, because they don't want those patients mixing with, quote unquote, the regular or good patients. And what does that mean in terms of public health and stigma and access to much needed medical supplies or resources? And so these questions are important. And again, you know, I'm a historian and we're all historians, and most of us are historians, and I keep going back to this. There is a framework for thinking about all these issues that we can't ignore.
So much. So Mizelle Sanford, who is right up the street at Penn, working with the wonderful Dorothy Roberts, has a question. I wonder if both Dr. Roberts and Dr. Mizell can reflect on the pandemic itself as a portal, establishing the conditions of possibility for new movements for freedom and Black liberation, while also heightening the visibility of disparities significantly impacting Black people. And he's framing this question, I can repeat it again if you'd like, by drawing on Dr. Mizell's reflections on cholera in particular as a sample. So I'll just repeat it once more. Mizelle Sanford wonders if you both can reflect on the pandemic itself as a portal, establishing the conditions of possibility for new movements for freedom and Black liberation, while also heightening the visibility of disparities significantly impacting Black people.
Given that Mizelle, I think, cited Rick on that one, I'm gonna let. sorry, Doc. Sorry, I'm gonna let you handle that one first. It's a great question. I'm gonna take a minute to get my thoughts together.
Mizelle is brilliant.
Yeah. No, that was a really good question. I mean, I think that you know, there are some connections again between pandemics and epidemics. And in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, for example, there were these conversations of a new war on poverty, which of course did not materialize. And I think that we're having these same conversations here in the aftermath of COVID. And I do think that this, you know, can be a movement to sort of really think about these conversations of poverty, of sort of racial exclusion. But we have to do something that we have not been good at doing in the past, which is maintaining momentum. One of the relics of medical history and pandemics and disasters is, you know, we get worked up for a while, and then when something else comes along, we forget and we move on. And so this also sort of speaks to this question of when, you know, when a pandemic ends and who gets to say it's ending, right? There are people, of course, who want this pandemic to be over yesterday, and they're trying to convince us that this pandemic is over. In some ways, you know, people have said that the HIV/AIDS, you know, pandemic is over, which of course is not in many communities. Even with the introduction of highly antiretroviral drugs, you know, HIV/AIDS, you know, is still a pandemic in certain communities. And so I think that we have to begin to anticipate fully the resources that are needed, understanding that to cite someone who does environmental history, disasters are sort of the price we must pay to live on the planet. And pandemics and epidemics and disease are the price that we must pay to live on the planet as well. And so we have to begin to think about, you know, what this pandemic reveals about race and inequality, and begin to systematically address those issues in a way that's not just sort of wordsmith, but really brings about a significant change.
Thank you for giving me a couple minutes to get my thoughts together, Rick. I promise I'll get the next one. He says at the end of the panel. Yeah, I would. Yeah, I get asked that a lot, and I have a range of answers to that, I guess, or at least a range of thoughts. On one hand, certainly the spotlight that a number of us have put on the structural inequalities, you know, with which COVID-19 came into contact. Those were inequalities that existed before it showed up. Certainly the way that we've been able to highlight that, I think, has moved the discussion forward. At the same time, I'm very cautious about thinking about, and I've heard the portal theory used, and I'm a bit cautious about it as a political theory, because I don't think that an epidemic is by itself de facto and a priori something that can lead to something better or that will automatically lead to something worse. It's really our reaction and how we in politics, and I mean politics with a lowercase p, not our elected officials, upon whom we can rely very little, to be honest with you. It's how we do our lowercase politics and how we leverage some of that discussion moving forward. I think, and what also makes me, I'm not pessimistic. I try as much as possible never to be pessimistic. I don't think I work with a lot of activists, and they themselves have no room for pessimism. And to honor their work, I can't carry that pessimism either. So I'm not pessimistic, I'm just cautious. And I think that there are ways in which that caution comes from the economic havoc that this has wreaked on Black America. The adage that when America catches a cold, Black America catches pneumonia goes back to the Great Depression. I forget who it was that said that. It might have been Rayford. I don't know. Rick, do you know who this? Do you remember?
Yeah, I know the term. I can't remember the moment.
Yeah, it might be like the National Urban League or somebody there who said that. And metaphor that it was 90 years ago, it's quite literal now in the sense, we're talking about an airborne pandemic. It has wreaked havoc on our physical health, because keep in mind that mortality is just the tip of that iceberg. A severe case can leave you, quite damaged with lung damage and maybe even, brain damage of, mild, hopefully, for years to come. But then also we're economically damaged. A report from the Economic Policy Institute came out, I think about a week or so ago, which delineates that. They're finding some of the same things in the UK with their BAME populations, Black, Asian, and minority ethnicities. And so we're starting to pay attention to the economic havoc. And so I worry that it may be a while in an economy where we are last hired and first fired. This may take, the American economy has to do really well for us to do well or just okay. So I'm just very cautious about that, but I'm also very optimistic about what we can do to strategically leverage this. I think something completely unrelated to COVID is the attention and global outrage over the deaths of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, and Rayshard Brooks, which is just, I mean, it's coincidence in the sense that happened during the pandemic. There might not be a coincidence of the protests in the sense that we're all very much, we've seen some disappointing behavior in our governments from the pandemic, but before the pandemic. And I think now this is the movement that catches fire, a movement it's been on fire for 20 something years, but we haven't seen this kind of global uprising against police murder and more broadly structural violence. Certainly, I don't think in my generation, that's since like 1968. So that makes me optimistic, but that's, I think, also about what this movement that has already been on the ground has been able to strategically leverage. If the portal is there, it's because they created it back in the 1990s and have been keeping it open as much as possible. So I more or less spent a lot of time dodging the question, Mizell, but it's definitely the relevant question of the moment. So thank you for that.
So thank you all. Okay, I'm unmuted here. Thank you all. I have 2 open questions, but what I'm going to do, because we literally have 3 minutes left, I'm going to put your contact information, just your either, if you're comfortable, your email addresses, so that I can send you those questions. One is from our outgoing dissertation Mellon Fellow. And so I'll ask that for Brandy Waters. Hello, everyone. Building on Mizelle's question on COVID and emerging possibilities of Black liberation, how might we also consider the international context of racism and epidemics as well? I'm thinking of the ways that deaths from COVID, police brutality, and structural racism are overrepresented among Black people throughout the diaspora. Might our increased activity online spur us toward a transnational approach to addressing the intersections of racism and epidemics that also historically informed us? Thanks for a great panel. Taylor Robinson has another one. Taylor is really interested in kind of pedagogical issues. Taylor says, how do you as historians, and I'll send this to you, pose your research to those in the STEM field who sometimes need to see statistics and data in order to understand inequalities? And then Yvonne Sun asked, if we have time, Yvonne, we don't, but I promise you they'll answer your question. I'm wondering how dietary stereotypes contribute to racism in infectious diseases. So I just wanted to pose that to those who are attending to see the range of questions and thoughts that this conversation has sparked amongst those who are attending. What I'm gonna do, and I'm gonna follow on Sam here because both of them know me, I am forever the optimist, even in times of turmoil, as we're all experiencing with political unrest, living through a global pandemic, where we don't have a vaccine, and the only thing we seem certain about is uncertainty. And so I want to end here with maybe a few short bullet points about what we can learn from past epidemics or pandemics that can help prepare us intellectually, perhaps emotionally, around the issue of race and racism. And if you could offer that because of brevity and kind of short bullet points, I would be forever grateful. Sam and Rick.
I think I just promised Rick that I would be first on the next go up. I'm starting to regret that because those are three great questions. Clearly, I'm not going to answer all three of your questions, plus the fourth that you proposed, Dr. Cooper Owens. I'll take a stab maybe at one of them or two of them. I would say just going to the international one, I think actually that's where a lot of the fire is actually in terms of health politics. The United States doesn't really, as you probably have guessed from the president's response to the WHO, doesn't really participate in some of the international discussions or conventions around what health is. For example, WHO, I think decades ago, said that more than 16 days of solitary confinement qualifies as torture, whereas we routinely have people there for months or years, sometimes decades. We don't pay attention to, we as a country that is, don't pay attention to that at all. But if you look at some of the grassroots movements in other countries, you see some really interesting activity. I mean, South Africa has had and Brazil too, both have had fascinating histories of HIV activism and education, largely because of structural determinants of health and structural racism in both of those polities. In terms of police brutality, what our colleagues, meaning our comrades in France, have been doing is very interesting. In a lot of ways, they take the lead from us in terms of their protest politics, but the way that's elaborating there, I think, is particularly fascinating and worth our attention, because certainly there might be things that we can learn there as well. And that's just the question spoke about the diaspora, but I think we could even look beyond the diaspora, because racialization, kind of like my comments on stigma, and what Dr. Mizell was saying about asking people to define race, it's really part of a larger ideology. So wherever you find these dynamics of racialization, you're going to find power dynamics at play that will be instructive, not just to how we do our research, but how we do our politics. In terms of, I'm just going to take your question, Professor Owens, about lessons learned. I think, honestly, one of the earlier comments that was made at the top that Dr. Mizell said about epidemics telling us a lot about society, and I think is really the lesson that needs to be learned again and again. We seemingly go through epidemics over and over again without learning the lesson. The triumphant message when we look back on them is how we defeated this disease, how we got the polio vaccine, how, et cetera, et cetera. We're still, looking for that moonshot for cancer, for example. But we don't really think about how our levels of preparedness should have gone to political preparedness, social equality as a measure of public health preparedness, and also how we read a landscape and why we feel so compelled to map a scientized narrative of, and as I think Dr. Mizell said, a militarized narrative of invasion upon our own population that we draw a virus as being an invader, and that automatically means that people carrying that virus can be seen as invaders. And we've never seemed to learn that lesson. Like, I'm not quite sure why, except that maybe we're just a kind of very militaristic country. So, yeah, thank you.
So very quickly, I'm gonna take a stab at the STEM question. Numbers are problematic, and we always contextualize numbers. Now people can sort of blindly regurgitate, numbers of diabetics or diabetes, saying that African Americans, and the term that's used, Hispanics, suffered disproportionately from diabetes. So when someone asks me about diabetes and Hispanics, my first question is, what does the term Hispanic mean? Right? Are you talking about people from Mexico? Are you talking about Caribbean, West Indies? I mean, what do you mean? What is meant by Hispanic, which is a very contested term, and the numbers are contested as well, right? So, going back to the mid 20th century, right? So there was a conflation of numbers at times in public health and census literature, where Asians, for example, were considered to be largely white within public health literature. Native Americans and Mexicans, for example, were largely considered to be white. And so this conflation of numbers and how we think about these questions is problematic. I asked my students on the first day of class, if you were alive in 1930, and how would you describe yourself on the census? And I started getting Scotch Irish, East Indian, all kinds of stuff. Where there were moments during the 20th century where you were either black or obviously not black, right? And so that conflation then problematizes this question of statistics. So providing a broader framework is important. And to Didi, your last point, I would just say quickly that disease is part of the human experience. There's never been a point where human beings have not had to deal with disease. But disease is also about power and entitlement. And who has access to resources is fundamentally a violent enterprise and rife with questions of race and power.
Thank you all so much. I am so happy to have had these two brilliant scholars share their knowledge, their expertise. You can see, I'm old because I'm clapping, but the younger folk are snapping fingers. So I guess that's a really good sign when the Gen Zs are snapping fingers. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for your questions to our interns. They were really, really smart, probing questions. And also Dr. Fenton, I'm so happy we were able to collaborate again. I'd just like to say for those who have attended, you can join us for session 2, July 1st. It's Wednesday, July 1st. The information is in the chat with Dr. Richard Mizell. Same place, same time. And there's a link that has been provided for you to register. You can also go on the library company's page, and that information is there too. So thank you all very much for joining us. Have a good evening.
Be safe, everybody.
All right, everybody. Be safe.